So very pleased and proud to introduce our speaker for today's meeting. Dr. Deb Bushway is the Interim President and CEO at Northwestern Health Sciences University and an expert, it's not an understatement to say, on competency-based education. She's previously worked directly with the Department of Education on consulting and supporting the competency-based education as a next step in the evolution of higher education in the United States, and is involved in many other organizations, including the Lumina Foundation on competency-based education, and just very recently just published a book with a couple of her colleagues on the topic of leadership in of competency-based education, and she may want to say a little more about that. We had a little on-campus celebration actually on just the other day to congratulate her on publishing that book. So good stuff. So with that, pleased to welcome and turn it over to Dr. Deb Bushway.
Thanks, Dale, and thanks for having me. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Dale, I think, did a great job introducing me. I have been doing competency-based education for a number of years and developed two programs that are called direct assessment, and I'll explain more what that means. But basically, it's a model of competency-based education that frees the program from credit hour constraints. So let me talk through. My plan was thinking, look, why don't I lay some groundwork about defining what CBE is, or maybe what it isn't as well, what the current version of it looks like, how it's understood sort of in the practicing higher ed, broader higher ed world. What I would also say to you as context is this is still an extremely relevant topic in that at the federal level, there is a lot of interest, bipartisan interest actually, in CBE. Also in January, I was invited to testify in front of the Health Committee, the U.S. Senate Health Committee, regarding competency-based education and its potential to move higher ed forward. And there's a tremendous amount of interest in finding statutory and regulatory solutions that move us into that innovation space in this area. Also, the department, the U.S. Department of Education, has announced something that they call a negotiated rulemaking, which I don't know if anybody here would be familiar with, but the short version of it is, there's statute and then there's regulation, and the department develops regulation to interpret statute, and as part of that process, they invite external experts into the conversation, and that's this thing called the negotiated rulemaking. There's one upcoming this spring. They've just announced a call for negotiators, but it's a giant set of topics, but competency-based education is indeed a subgroup that they're forming, and one of the key topics. Most of us who watch that kind of stuff think they've got too many topics to have any meaningful discourse and to land on anything very significant. At the same time, it's an opportunity for us to all learn and think through how CBE might be treated in future higher ed authorization acts, because as you probably also know, we are about 2 or 3 years with an expired higher ed authorization act. Of course, not thinking we're going to get any traction on that this year and maybe not even next year, but still informing the thinking in that way. And I'll talk more if you want to when I get to the federal and state regulatory pieces. So pause there. Any thoughts or questions about what I just said? Okay. It's always hard in these environments, and you may well know all this. I don't know you, so I may be telling you things you already know. So excuse me when I do that. So what is competency-based education? And I have a few definitions. One of the things that all the regulators will tell you is that it would be great if you guys would all agree on one definition. And I think we're getting closer, but we haven't arrived. But the idea behind competency-based education is that, just what it says on this slide, that it's really focused on actual student learning and the application of that learning rather than time spent in class / on material. And And this is particularly troubling or hard or challenging for professions like many of ours, where, frankly, the licensing laws are written in hours, right? So that's one of the local, state kind of level problems that many CBE programs face across the board. People have solved it in some professions, and we can talk more about that, or at least I wouldn't say solved, that's an exaggeration. They've made inroads. But the key thing is that a learner's progress through a program is measured when they demonstrate their competency through a system of rigorous assessments, meaning that they can prove that they've mastered the skills and knowledge that are required for a competency. So people don't progress without demonstrating each competency, and we'll talk more about what a competency might mean. This sometimes feels to people like it might be easier. In fact, if you think about a standard, and we can move to the next slide while I'm jabbering away. Thank you, that was fast. If you think about a standard academic program where, let's just take my favorite example is writing. Let's just take writing for an example. You may have to have a class in writing, maybe even 2 classes in writing. And even if you've got an institution where they've infused writing across the curriculum, in most of your courses, there will be some points awarded for writing, but they're so minimal in any given course, you probably can get a D, maybe even an F in terms of your writing and pass the course without a problem. In a competency-based model, you'd have to demonstrate that writing competency if we were going to assess it everywhere that we assessed it, or at least thoroughly enough for it to feel like it was demonstrated at the credential level. I will use the term credential rather than degree a lot, because one of the things competency-based education does is allow us to disaggregate away from the degree as sort of this monolithic thing that's earned and move down to various kinds of credentials that may stack toward degrees or may not be. There may be some of our professions where the degree might even not be necessary in its traditional way. I may be wrong about that. It may be completely necessary. So in this slide, we're really talking about the idea that competency-based, this is a definition from CBEN, which I do have on the back slide, a set of resources, back slides. CBEN stands for Competency-Based Education Network, and it's a membership organization of, I think, right now, like 150 organizations, something like that, who are engaged in doing competency-based education. And we just had a conference also that's called CBE Exchange, so there's not another one until next year, but if anyone were truly interested in that, it would be worthwhile attending. That had about 430 people in attendance at it, all people who are either engaged in doing CBE or interested in being engaged in doing CBE. And we just actually co-published some research with a group called AIR out of Washington, D.C., the American Institutes of Research, about how many CBE programs there are in the country and the trends there. So I can speak more about that. But this is the CBEN definition. And you can see this idea that it combines an intentional and transparent approach to curricular design with a model in which the time it takes to demonstrate competency varies and the expectations about learning are held constant. This is a key thing here. What we do now is we hold constant the amount of time, we call those terms, courses, and vary the amount of learning that a student gets done in that amount of time. And we measure how much learning occurs in some ways, and we assign grades to indicate how much learning has occurred. But we don't hold the learning constant. So that this approach flips that on its ear a bit and says, no, we're going to say, we're going to hold the learning outcome constant and vary the amount of time it takes to get there. Perhaps this is material you're very familiar with, and you'll be able to move relatively quickly through the material. That's fine. Perhaps you've never seen this in your life, and it's really not your strong suit, and then you can take longer. As long as there's federal financial aid involved, there is like a limit on how slow you can go, a minimal speed limit, so to speak. So it's not as slow as you want as long as there's federal aid involved. But it doesn't have to be done in a term, which is a whole different mindset for us to think about. And then basically that they acquire and demonstrate their knowledge and skills by engaging in these learning exercises, and that assessments are robust, meaningful, and authentic. So the authentic thing becomes very important. The idea is that any assessment of a competency ought to insist that a person has to demonstrate their ability to apply the knowledge and skills that they've learned in a novel situation. Now, most of these programs will say that we are agnostic as to the source of learning, meaning you could have learned this content anywhere, but you have to integrate it and synthesize it into this competency in the way that we've defined it for this program in order to move forward in the program. So let me pause here and see if you have comments, thoughts. I've put you to sleep, right? So we'll move to the next.
No, you have not put us to sleep. We're listening, and I don't see any chats yet, so thanks for pausing.
Okay. No, that's fine. I'll just keep pausing. So the next slide is really just a visual of key components in competency-based education. It's a combination of theory and practical application delivered through the curriculum with faculty and authentic assessments working together in a positive cycle, iterative cycle that in each phase informing the other. I'm condensing a ton of information here, I realize, so I'll just keep plowing ahead. We'll go to the next slide if you don't. So the next slide talks about that there are a wide range of models that emerge, and we've placed this on a continuum that on the one hand, there are, I think in this country about, at this point, 8 institutions who've been approved for what's called direct assessment. So if you flip for a second to the next slide, sorry to flip back and forth, but I'll talk about the next slide for a minute. Yeah, perfect. So this big mess is meant to indicate a lot of the stuff that's being talked about out in the world, and then I think I'll flip back to the continuum. Probably got these in a bad sequence. So competency-based learning, no, sorry, not yet. I am totally confusing you. Let's stay on the circles, the Venn diagram one. Excellent, thanks. So competency-based learning is meant to be this sort of large ecosystem that's out there, and you'll hear these various kinds of learning, some of which are completely competency-based, some of which are partially competency-based. And then within that, there's a specific sphere or specific implementation of this that we talk about as competency-based education. So it's an actual program of some sort that results in some sort of end credential that is built with this backward design intentionality that we're talking about, that I'll talk more about. So that's the CBE circle. And then within that, where it says DA, that's what's called direct assessment. And direct assessment is a term that's written into the Federal Financial Aid Code, the statute, that says basically that a program can deliver federal aid in lieu of credit hours through direct assessment of learning. And there are about 8 institutions in the country who've gotten approval to do that at this point in time. I was at the second one to get it, and then I was at the third one to get it. So what that means is that in that model, you're no longer measuring credit hour, and as we all know, in 2008, 10, the federal government got very specific about what credit hour meant, and they did it for very specific reasons. But you're no longer bound to that credit hour. A student can indeed move as quickly as they want. Again, if there is federal aid involved, there is a minimum speed limit. But, so that's what this slide is trying to explain to people, is that we use now competencies as become almost a very common term, and we use them in a variety of ways, but there's a very specific subset that's competency-based education, and then another very specific subset that's direct assessment. So now if you go back to my continuum slide, if you don't mind. This is meant to talk about those CBE programs, just that part in that bubble. And even there's a wide range that goes from this direct assessment piece where there are no courses, no credit hours, you have to know your competencies and graduate, to learning being measured by direct assessment tools, all the way to many institutions who are offering these, there's like, we heard from about over 500 programs that are out there being competency-based in the post-secondary space. There's most of them are still course-based, term-based, and they haven't disrupted their whole federal financial aid system in order to deliver this. But the competencies, they integrate discrete competencies into a single course, and learning is still measured by this combination of seat time and basically teacher-created assessments rather than program-level assessments, which you get in a direct assessment, high-quality CBE program. Okay, pausing again, just in case. All right. Well, hearing nothing, then let's go to the slide that says competency defined. So what is a competency? In a lot of the work I do, what we'd love to see is that competency became the currency in higher education rather than the credit hour being the currency in higher education. There's a lot of trouble with credit hour. People don't know what it means. There's not much transparency. Even certainly at the degree level, you say you got a degree in something, we don't really know. Employers, transfer institutions, nobody really knows what you learned and are able to do as a result of that, earning that credential. In a competency model, we would articulate, and there are lots of transcripting efforts out there and some transcripts in existence that transcribe only the competency, although there has to be a cross-selected credit hour, and I can talk that through. But the competency should break open this sort of black box of the credential and allow people to peer inside and see, oh, here's what this person knows and is able to do as a result of having earned this credential or earned these competencies, demonstrated these competencies. But there's a little bit of a stereotype in the world that a competency only can be used for lower level kinds of skill sets. So maybe you can have a competency-based truck driving program, which actually a couple of institutions do. But you really can't have competency-based liberal arts, for example, or maybe you can't even have competency-based acupuncture or massage therapy or chiro, because these are higher order thinking projects. And the truth is that no, a competency well-defined mandates that a person knows the theory underlying it, has the requisite skills and abilities, and is able to apply those in novel situations. We did add this bit of intellectual behaviors or dispositions. It's actually the education folks in their specialized accreditor, they talk about dispositions and assessing dispositions. And I think that's actually a really important part of competencies for all of the healthcare professions. Are people bringing to the table the dispositions that they need to if they're going to go out and treat people in the public? And are we assessing those effectively? Have we even defined those, and could we even agree upon them if we tried to? So this is a framework for how to define a robust competency. And of course then out of that, you would have to define an assessment that captured all of these components, not just the ability to do a specific thing. I can give you an example from my past about where people thought they had the competency and really they just had the skill. So I'm a psychologist, and people used to want to get a PLA, which is a prior learning assessment. They would want credit for behavioral therapy course because they had worked in a group home. And they could bring in all kinds of examples of where they had done basically behavioral interventions with people, and they could bring me the charts to track the behaviors and the systems that were in place to reward the desired behaviors and extinguish the undesired behaviors and all of that. But if I asked them why or on how come these things worked or what was the theory, they couldn't tell me. So that means they don't have the full competency, right? They have to have the theory underlying it as well. The next two slides, if you want to scoot to them, are really just some of the institutions, colleges out there that are doing actually competency-based education. So you can go to the next one as well. It just gives you a sense of the range of kinds of institutions doing it at this point in time, and there are more than that at this point. Okay, then I'm going to talk a little bit, if you go to the next slide, about, and I could tell you more about any of those institutions and what they're doing if that's of interest later. So CBEN, this organization that I talked about earlier, they've built a quality framework for what is a quality CBE program. And these are the elements of a quality CBE program. If you go to CBEN's website, there are a number of resources, including a much more extended document that is the framework itself, a user's guide to the framework with some examples of institutions that have used the framework, some examples of ways people might use it, some examples of if you're trying to build a CBE program, who should be at the table in your discussion, early decisions you have to make about where on that continuum that I showed, where do you want to be? Do you want to still stay, term-based, or do you really want to be disruptive? And who's on board for your disruption? And believe me, the further right you go on that continuum, the more people you need engaged in your institution to make sure that they're on board early rather than later. That's where I've seen things not work for institutions, is when they've moved pretty far down this path and forgot to tell anyone else at their institution. Of course, that doesn't go well with anything usually, right? So anyway, these are the key things. Institutional commitment to and capacity for CBE innovation. It does disrupt almost every office of the place, so you need support from a pretty high level. Even if the entire institution isn't going to do this, it just annoys most of the offices and systems that you have. You have to make sure that you've identified clear, measurable, meaningful, and integrated competencies. So one of the key things, one of the key critiques we often hear, about CBE is, well, you've just disaggregated that learning experience to sort of this set of discrete bubbles. It's like, no. We have probably disaggregated, but then there has to be an intentional re-aggregation, an intentional synthesis of what a person has learned. And I don't think we can assume that in our standard education that synthesis always occurs either. There has to be a coherent, competency-driven program and curriculum design. So what people talk about here is that you start with the end competencies in mind. So what, in whatever credential you're designing, what does a competent practitioner, in this case, look like? What are the key competencies someone has to have? Then how do you make sure you scaffold them effectively throughout, if you have a year to teach it, if you have 3 years to teach it? How do you backward design from that endpoint? How do you build your program from the back to the front with the end in mind? Rather than, I think how most programs are built still, no matter where I've seen it, is, okay, I'm going to build, I'll pick on my own discipline. I'm going to build a psych major. Okay, they have to have experimental, they have to have stats, they have to have abnormal, they have to have developmental. Well, okay, why? What's the point? So you see, it's a very different model. We often talk about that this kind of curricular design moves teaching, and as well as program design, of course, but also moves teaching from being an individual sport to a team sport, right? This is an integration at a different level. People aren't just teaching what they want. And, in the old model, if I wanted to teach this in abnormal and emphasize that and do bare bones on children's abnormal, I could do that. In a competency model, the outcomes would be articulated, and everybody would know what they expected to learn, and thus what would be expected to be offered to them. I think the other piece here that's important is a credential level assessment strategy with robust implementation. So most CBE programs, like I said, rely on what I would call authentic assessment, and I think we talk about authentic as being ways in which the demonstration of the competency is as much as possible and as closely as possible approximates the way someone would have to demonstrate that competency in a real-life situation. I'll just say my always standard rude comment. It's not that often in my work life that I've been asked to take a multiple choice exam. Now, I might need that content. That might be part of what scaffolds me to a demonstration of competency. But the demonstration of competency is likely more complex than that. Often there's strong collaboration with some external partners who help inform both the definition of the competencies and the assessment so that there's buy-in there. And the rest I think is pretty straight. I mean, I could talk obviously forever, as you probably have already figured out, about all of this. Any thoughts about that? Or we can move on to the next slide. Okay, so backward design, I just thought I'd give a little bit more about what we mean by backward design. So as I was talking about it previously, in the traditional model, you kind of say, here's the course description. You have a catalog description and some objectives, right? But in backward design, you start with the competency statements. You list the big ideas. You may or may not be familiar with the idea of Bloom's taxonomy, which helps level the kind of integrative thinking that people ought to be doing. We all wish there was something newer or more current than Bloom's, and if you know of it, happy to hear of it. But the idea is that as you advance in your credential level, you move through simply demonstrating knowledge to all the way to synthesizing and creating new knowledge at the higher levels of that taxonomy. Step 2 in a traditional model, again, stereotyping, I realize, but you decide what are some readings, assignments, blah, 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 that people can learn from. In a backward design model, you sort of use the assessment as formative information for the student and the faculty member to understand what content the person needs to learn at this point. I strongly believe that a lot of the lecture we do, I hope I don't offend anybody too much when I say this, but a lot of the content has been commoditized. We can find content on the internet, and people do. So we have to teach people how to discern good content from faulty content, and we have to bring the human touch to the elements where it's most important. How do you integrate? How do you synthesize? How do you deal with a patient, if that's what we're teaching them? So bring us in at the top of our skill set rather than delivering content only. So that's part of what we talk about here. Then in step 3, we sort of give people tests and see if they did it. Step 3 in the backward design model is then you build in the educational journey. You've kind of got the assessments. You've got make sure that your assessment blueprint aligns with the outcomes you're trying to get. And then you start filling in the gaps with, well, what do people, how can we deliver OER or any other content, our homemade content, a book, whatever it is that's useful to people to get them to the competency level, demonstrations and things like that. All right, so let's scurry to the next one, and then we'll talk through and maybe on to the next slide. So what are accreditors doing in this space? And these are just a list, and I kind of could drone on and on about each accreditor, but so these are, as you are well aware, there are regional accreditors, national accreditors, and specialized accreditor. And, as Mike was talking about the CCE, that's a specialized accreditor. And most of the institutional accreditors have come along with some ways of dealing with the direct assessment and the competency-based model. But they have been under a tremendous amount of scrutiny from the Office of the Inspector General, from the Department of Education, and especially the largest one, which is the HLC, which is the Midwest region, basically. They actually got huge hand slappings from the OIG regarding the way they were granting credit and also the way they were approving competency-based programs. So this caused everyone to get very cautious in the creditor world, and caused CRAC is the Council on Regional Accrediting Commission, so the leaders of all the regional accreditors are members of CRAC. So they actually have taken a position and written a definition for what CBE is. I didn't include that in the deck, but I think I probably have a link to it later. Actually, all of the accreditors now have approved, but HLC, SOX, and WASC have probably approved the most. NEASC, I just did a site visit for NEASC for their giant direct assessment program as well. So then DIAC is one of the national accreditors that's also doing a lot. Under specialized accreditors, the people that have moved the most, if you move to the next slide, the people that have moved the most actually are the nursing. So CCNE has collaborated with, I know now, 2 direct assessments. So these are programs that are freed from seat time, freed from credit hour compliance, and they've accredited the UW Milwaukee's BSN program and Capella's BSN program. So what UW Milwaukee did is they maintained the identical competencies for their FLEX program as they had with their face-to-face program, and they submitted basically a change of modality, and the CCNA did approve them. So that's how that went forward. Also, oops, there's a missing A, so it should be ACBSP, Accreditation Council for Business Schools and Programs. They've also accredited, there's 2 business specialized accreditor, but this is one of them. The other one has not done this, but they've accredited the Flex Path programs at Capella, which are direct assessment programs. Then I'll just scurry on to the U.S. Department of Education stuff. At the Department of Education, there's a direct assessment review team that does the approvals for these. They actually also got their hands slapped by the IG, the Inspector General, for not being consistent, and so some people had to endure another cycle of reviews from them. But like I said, there's only 8 institutions that are approved for direct assessment. Those 8 institutions offer well over 100 programs, but there's only 8 institutions approved for direct assessment. And I don't know if you want me to hear. I already sort of talked about HEA and negotiated rulemaking. I could talk about the experimental sites if you want, but I think I'll plow through this and then open it up for questions rather than continuing to drone on. The next slide is about the experimental sites. Happy to talk those through and explain those if that's of interest. But it is probably useful to talk about the fact that the Office of the Inspector General is an independent office within the U.S. Department of Education, and they, about a year ago, released a report that Western Governors University, which is, probably many of you have heard of it, advertises heavily. It was founded basically by governors in the western part of the state, is large, probably has, I think they have, I don't know, around 100,000 students, and have pitched themselves as the original competency-based education program. What they found in this report is that Western Governors was non-compliant with the requirements for distance education, and because there's this offered largely through distance. They were found to be correspondence courses. The finding was that they owed the government hundreds of millions of dollars. That will never happen, and they won't ever get paid. I mean, that will just never happen. But it did cause a lot of focus on this and a lot of debate in sort of the legislative environment. So let's go to the next slide, and then I thought I could summarize with maybe some benefits and barriers, and then see if people have any comments or thoughts. So benefits to doing this work is it's working to help solve the access, cost, success triangle. So one of those sort of iron triangles that we talk about in higher ed or post-secondary is this idea that these 3 pieces go together. If you allow pretty open access, you risk lower student success rates, and higher costs. If I can let anybody in. If I have a open checkbook, I can make anyone successful in my program, most likely, right? If I'm not concerned about cost to the institution or the student. The same is if I'm not concerned about success, I can open access. But so you understand my point. But we think that competency-based education can help push the flexibility into that triangle with personalizing the educational experience so that it's not a one-size-fits-all experience for students, and people feel both valued. There's also, in our country, over 30 million individuals with some college and no credential. Most of those folks don't want to come back and have to take over what they've already been taught or learned, and so we think this is a pathway to help bring some of those folks in, move them into higher paying jobs and better credentials for the future. So you can see that. Then if we move to the next slide, the challenges are that, there's challenges in terms of making the internal and external data systems and technology work. We need, there's pushback from both external and internal. The financial model, although there's some research out there about the financial model does break even in these programs about the 5th year, but there is substantial investment. So this isn't like a quick and dirty thing to do to help drive up your gap in enrollment for a given term, but there are challenges. And then the next slides are really just a set of resources that I thought might be interesting. So I'll stop talking and see if anybody is still there and has any questions.
Well, fantastic. We do have a question in the chat, so why don't I start with that, and then if other folks want to put their questions in the chat, we can move from there. So Diane asks, how did they determine the experiential sites? And Deb, would you like me to move back to that slide as you answer that? Okay.
Sure. Yep. So the experimental sites, if you go, I'm not sure if I have that link here or not, to be honest with you, but I definitely could get you that. It was an application process. So the department decided that they wanted to do some, so I'll back up a little bit. It's under the power of the Department of Education to waive regulation, but not to change statute except in a very few narrow components. So they can waive some of their own internal requirements to allow for some experimentation with new models, and that's what these experimental sites were meant to do. So I think they're still open, and I think an institution, if they really wanted to, could probably still participate, but it's an application process to the Department of Education. And there was one about prior learning assessment. So I'm sorry if you already know this, but I'll just say it is a prior learning assessment. So federal financial aid at the core, the philosophy is that it's paying for learning, not for assessment of learning. And so there is no, you cannot get federal aid for prior learning assessment. But this allowed federal aid to flow to, if there was a need for a pay to take an assessment to get the PLA, then you could fold that into your basically cost of education for the term. The others are pretty technical, which I'm happy to go into, but I feel like they might just put you all to sleep. And then, except for the last one, which is called the QUIP, that got a fair amount of press because the idea here was that so you can have 49% of any credential offered by an external party. This allows an institution of higher ed to partner with, like, let's say, a coding boot camp. The coding boot camp could offer 100% of the educational experience as long as it was overseen by the institution and there was this QAE involved. And you could get federal aid for the students in that program. So again, that was an application. That one got a lot of applications, and only a few people got through. I'm going to say like a dozen programs were accepted, but I think only one of them, well, I know only one of them is actually functioning. I hope that answers.
Thank you, Deb. I just asked if in the chat if that answered their follow-up. But we do have another question from Bill Meeker. In chiropractic education, even with the consensus on CBE given, what are the 3 to 4 biggest specific challenges to implementation?
Yeah, great question. So, I mean, the biggest one I'm going to tell you is the emphasis on hours. So it's written into licensure requirements in, I think, all states. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but most states. So what happens is when you have that hours requirement at the licensure level, then you never are going to be able to free yourself entirely from the seat time worry, right? And, you know, the hours thing is really just built in an industrial model assumption about how education occurs, that a certain amount of time means that you basically will gain the knowledge required. So that's a huge one, right? I think also another big challenge is, do we have the competencies defined in chiropractic education in a way that will move us to this? Like, do we have that right, or ought we to keep? I mean, we never are going to get anything right out of the gate, so in any field, so we ought to keep iterating there as well. And then I think it's a failure to, sort of a lack of education about what is competency-based education and how can it help the students. So I'd say those are like the 3 biggest ones for me. It's sort of a lack of understanding of what competency-based education really is and could bring, sort of this idea of really being rooted in an hours-based model probably are the 2 biggest ones if I were to synthesize. Does that make sense?
I'll keep monitoring the chat to see if there's follow-up questions from that, but thank you. We do have another question from Gina Kadar. How would this work with a cohort model? Can the student progress much faster than their cohort? Is there a need to embed catch-up points in the curriculum?
Yeah, great question. Great question. So there are institutions that do this with cohort models, but they're shorter, right? And yes, the thing is that we have to think through, you know, what are the benefits of the cohort model, and how can you build those benefits into a different experience? So I assume the benefits are for the student. So the other piece in all this is that this becomes a very student-centric model rather than an institutional-centric model, right? And that's what I mean by it challenges a lot of institutional practices and assumptions. So I'm thinking, you know, a couple of the technical schools still have stayed cohort model, and what it does is the flexibility is not as broad. So if you go back to my sort of continuum, those programs are probably, you know, a third of the way from the left side that really want to retain the cohort model, because you can allow the person to move flexibly within limits, right? We want the cohort to catch up with them, or maybe they're moving more slowly, and there's maybe a time at which you ask them to drop back to a previous cohort, or maybe for the fast movers you allow them to move into a more advanced, so to speak, cohort. But the people who don't want to do that just sort of leave this modified term approach in place, and the person can move within that term as fast or slow as they need. Now, I didn't say this, but most of the direct assessment programs are subscription-based, meaning that you pay by a payment period, not by the term. And then within that payment period, you have access to demonstrating as many competencies as works out for you. And people have different ways they go about it. A couple of the programs limit, like you can only attempt 2 at a time, because people get what I used to call like the buffet syndrome. Like they sign up for all these competencies and then they don't do any. Like you go to the buffet, you're starving, you see all that food, you're like, oh, I can't eat anything, I'm full. So there's lots of ways of helping support students in making wise choices and good pathways through it. But the subscription model is a key part of freeing up from the term and freeing up from the course construct. But most people don't do that. Most people are still letting people pay by the term, maybe it's a banded tuition model, which that works somewhat like a subscription model. But the point is that at the end of a given term, you'd make decisions about the next term for progress. So it would definitely be modifying the cohort experience, but if you decided, look, what the cohort brings is so valuable and so important that we don't want to disrupt it, you could just do exactly as you suggested, which is build those safety nets into the model and stick with the cohort.
Deb, we've only got a couple more minutes and we've got 2 more questions. So if people can stay on and you're able to answer them, that'd be great. One is from Beth Howlett, our Education Working Group co-chair. Can you pilot this in parts of a program where all elements of that program are designed to prepare students for a specific type of licensing of practice, or is the choice to implement CBE really all or nothing if it is to be successful?
Great question. So I think we used to think it had to be an all or nothing, but I think we've moved away from that to thinking, no, go ahead and pilot it. The trick is you have to know when you're piloting it that you're not going to get the full benefit from it until you get deeper into an implementation. And you have to decide the reasons that you would do it. If the key reason is transparency of learning to the students and to external constituents such as boards or employers, then you can get the benefit in a term-based model. You can start at the course level. I would just caution you that you do the backward design component. Even if you start at the course level, the idea of the backward design is still really important, if that makes any sense.
Great. All right, last question of today is from Sunny, Dr. Sunny, and is access cost success triangle that benefits from CBE associated with health systems triangle cost patient outcomes patient satisfaction? Does one triangle influence the other?
Well, now that I'm going to answer in 1 minute, right? That's such a great question. Right, such a great question. So, I mean, yes, I think you're talking about the same concepts. I don't think I actually had the triangle in this one, did I?
You just mentioned it somewhere, but
yeah.
I won't distract by trying to find it.
Oh, it's okay. Believe it or not, I tried to cut down the slides, and I know there were too many still. But I mean, I think you're exactly those combinations. Some way of what we're trying to do here is innovate to solve those barriers, so we can personalize the experience, drive the cost down, and still maintain or improve on the quality. Right? So it is the same triangle in the end, I think. Right?
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Dale and Beth, as Education Working Group co-chairs, I'll hand it back to both of you to thank our speaker and close the meeting, and we'll have this recording and the slides put up on our collaborative site. So thank you, and I turn it over to Beth and Dale. Great.
Well, thank you so much, Deb, our presenter for today, for taking the time to share all of this with you and for answering the questions. I'm sure if there are additional questions, we can certainly get those to Deb, and if you're interested in participating in some of the organizations or initiatives that are going on, we can help you figure out how to move forward in this area. So thanks again to everyone for being on the call, and Beth Howlett, anything to add as my co-chair?
Thank you for your excellent facilitation as always, and the great questions. I learned a lot in a really short period of time, so thanks to you, Deb.
That's great.
I hope it was useful, so thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks, everybody, and we will talk to you next time.
Bye-bye, all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.